Chapter 7. A Cake for Mrs. Allen. The long summer vacation began at the end of June. Mr. Phillips left the Avonlea school. The old minister left the church, too, and a new minister came. His name was Mr. Allen. He brought his pretty young wife with him. "I'll ask Mr. and Mrs. Allen to tea on Wednesday," said Marilla.
"Oh, Marilla," said Anne excitedly, "can I make a cake?"
"All right, Anne," said Marilla. On Wednesday morning, Anne got up early and made her cake. It looked very good. In the afternoon, Anne put flowers around the table. Then Mr. and Mrs. Allen arrived. "The table looks beautiful," they said. Anne felt very happy. She sat at the table with Matthew and Marilla. Matthew wore his best clothes.
"Would you like some cake, Mrs. Allen?" asked Anne. "I made it for you."
"Yes, please," said Mrs. Allen, and she smiled. Anne cut some cake for Mrs. Allen. Mrs. Allen put the cake in her mouth and started to eat it. But she didn't look very happy. "Is something wrong?" thought Marilla. She tried some cake, too. "Anne Shirley," she cried, "what did you put in this?"
Only vanilla,"
answered Anne. She went to the kitchen and brought back a small bottle. On the front of the bottle it said, "Best Vanilla." Marilla opened the bottle. "This isn't vanilla," she said. "It's medicine. Last week I broke the medicine bottle. I put the medicine into this old vanilla bottle."
"Medicine?" said Anne. "Oh!"
She ran upstairs to her room. She cried and cried. A little later, Anne heard somebody on the stairs, but she didn't look up.
"Oh, Marilla," she said, "I'm very unhappy. Everybody in Avonlea will hear about my cake. They'll laugh at me. I can't go downstairs. I can't look at Mrs. Allen again. I'm very sorry, Marilla. Please tell Mrs. Allen."
"You tell her, Anne," said Mrs. Allen. Anne looked up.
"Mrs. Allen?"
she said in surprise. "Yes, it's me," said Mrs. Allen, and laughed. "Don't cry, Anne. The medicine in the cake was a very funny mistake."
"I'm sorry, Mrs. Allen," said Anne. "I wanted to make a nice cake for you."
"I know," said Mrs. Allen. "Now please come down and show me your flowers. I'm very interested in flowers." Anne felt happy again. She went downstairs with Mrs. Allen, and nobody said anything about the cake. A week later, Anne ran into the kitchen at Green Gables. She was very excited. She had a letter in her hand.
"Mrs. Allen is inviting me to tea tomorrow afternoon," she said. "Look at this letter, Marilla. It says, 'Miss Anne Shirley, Green Gables.' Nobody called me Miss before."
The next afternoon, Anne went to tea with Mrs. Allen.
"I had a wonderful time with Mrs. Allen," she told Marilla later. "She's very kind, and she wore a beautiful dress. We talked for a long time. I told her about Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond and the orphanage. I told her about Green Gables and the school, too. Mrs. Allen told me something interesting. A new teacher is coming to Avonlea after the vacation. Her name is Miss Muriel Stacy. Isn't that a pretty name? I want to meet her very much."
Chapter 8. An Accident and a new dress. Some weeks later, Diana had a party. She invited Anne and the other girls in her class. They had a very good time. After tea, the girls played outside.
"Let's play a new game," said one of the girls. "Let's do exciting things. Who can climb the big tree by Diana's front door?"
One of the girls climbed the tree. Then another girl thought of something more exciting.
"Who can climb up to the top of Diana's house?" she said.
"I can!" cried Anne. She ran to the house.
"Stop, Anne!" called Diana. "That's very dangerous."
Anne started to climb to the top of the house, but it was very difficult. Suddenly, she fell to the ground. Diana ran to her.
"Oh, Anne, are you dead?" she said.
Anne opened her eyes. Her face was very white.
"No, I'm not dead, Diana," she said. "But my leg hurts. I can't walk."
Mr. Barry carried Anne home to Green Gables. When Marilla saw Mr. Barry with Anne in his arms, she felt very afraid. Was Anne dead? I love Anne very much, she thought. I know that now. She ran to Mr. Barry. What happened? She asked.
"Don't be afraid, Marilla," said Anne. "I fell off Diana's house."
Anne couldn't go back to school. She stayed home for 7 weeks. Her friends came to see her every day. They brought her flowers and books. She had many other visitors, too. Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Lynde came often. When Anne's leg was better, she went back to school. She liked Miss Stacy very much. Miss Stacy was a very good young teacher, and Anne worked hard in her lessons.
"I love Miss Stacy,"
Anne said to Marilla and Matthew one evening.
"She wants us to give a concert at Christmas. Isn't that exciting? Diana's going to sing a song, and I'm going to say 2 poems.
One evening, Matthew went into the kitchen at Green Gables. Anne's friends were there. They laughed and talked about the concert. They were very excited. Matthew watched them. Anne looks different from the other girls. But why? He thought. He thought all evening. Then suddenly he knew the answer. Anne's clothes are different, he thought. The other girls wear pretty dresses. Marilla makes good dresses for Anne, but they aren't very pretty. Then Matthew had an idea. I'm going to give Anne a new dress for Christmas, he thought. He went to the store in town and tried to buy a dress, but he couldn't because he didn't know much about girls' dresses. Maybe somebody can make a pretty dress for Anne, he thought. But who? I don't know many women in Avonlea. I can't ask Marilla. I know. I'll have to ask Mrs. Lynde. He went to see Mrs. Lynde. Of course I'll help you, Matthew, said Mrs. Lynde. And I won't tell Marilla. It'll be a surprise. On Christmas morning, Anne woke up early. She looked out of the window and felt very happy. The trees were white with snow. She ran downstairs into the kitchen, and Matthew gave her the dress. Anne started to cry. What's wrong? Said Matthew. Don't you like it?
Oh, yes, Matthew, answered Anne. I love the dress. It's beautiful. Thank you. I'm crying because I'm very happy.
That night, Anne wore her new dress to the concert. She said her 2 poems very well. Matthew and Marilla were at the concert too. Later they sat by the kitchen fire and talked.
"Anne did very well tonight,"
said Matthew. "Yes," said Marilla. "She's very smart, and she looked very nice in her new dress."
"She's 13 now,"
said Matthew.
"One day she'll leave the Avonlea school. We have to think about her future."
Some stupid mistakes. One spring afternoon, Marilla walked home. The country was very beautiful, and Marilla felt happy. Anne's at home, she thought. She'll make a good fire, and she'll have tea on the table. But Anne wasn't at Green Gables. There was no fire, and the tea wasn't ready. "Where is that girl?" thought Marilla angrily. "Is she playing with Diana again? She has to do housework first." Matthew came in from the farm, and he and Marilla had tea. But Anne didn't come. When it was dark, Marilla went upstairs to Anne's room. Anne was on her bed. "What's wrong, Anne?" said Marilla in surprise. "Are you sick?" "No, Marilla," said Anne unhappily. "Look at my hair." Marilla looked at Anne's hair. It was green.
"Anne Shirley," she said, "what did you do to it?"
"I dyed it," said Anne. "I hated my red hair. Today a man came to Green Gables. He wanted to sell us things. I saw a bottle of black hair dye in his box, so I bought it. But it made my hair green."
"Go and wash it," said Marilla. Anne washed her hair, but the green color didn't go away.
"Oh, Marilla," she said, "what shall I do? The other girls will laugh at me. I can't go to school."
Anne stayed home for a week. She washed her hair every day, but the green color stayed in her hair. "We'll have to cut it," Marilla said, and she cut Anne's hair short.
"I'll never hate my red hair again,"
Anne said. She went back to school. When her friends saw her short hair, they were very surprised. But Anne didn't tell them about the dye. After some weeks, Anne's hair looked prettier than before, and it wasn't as red. One day in the summer, Anne and her friends were by the river near Diana's house. There was an old boat there.
"Let's play a game," said Anne. "Do you remember that poem from school about a girl, Elaine? She was unhappy in love. She found a boat on the river and got into it. Then she died. The river carried the boat to a town. Everybody came and saw her. I'll be Elaine. I'll get into this old boat, and the river will carry it down to the bridge. Go and wait for me there."
Anne climbed into the bottom of the boat. The girls put flowers into her hands, and Anne closed her eyes.
"Oh," said the girls, "Anne really looks dead."
They pushed the boat out into the center of the river and ran to the bridge. The river was very fast and dangerous. The boat was old and not very strong. Suddenly, a lot of water came into the boat. Anne sat up. She was very afraid. The boat went past a large tree, and Anne caught the tree with her hands. The river carried the boat away. Then the boat went down to the bottom of the river. Diana and the other girls waited at the bridge. They saw the boat in the river, but they didn't see Anne.
"Anne's in the river," they cried. "Let's go for help."
They ran quickly to Diana's house. Anne was very cold and wet. She had her arms around the tree, but she couldn't move. Her arms hurt, and she felt very tired. "Help! Help!" she cried. "Why doesn't somebody come?" Suddenly, a small boat came down the river. A boy was in it. It was Gilbert Blythe. "Anne Shirley, what are you doing here?" he asked in surprise. Anne told him, and Gilbert brought his boat near the tree. He gave Anne his hand and pulled her into his boat. But Anne didn't look at him. "Thank you," she said coldly. "Please, let's be friends," said Gilbert. "I was rude about your hair in school, and I'm sorry, but your hair is very pretty now." "No," said Anne. "I'll never be friends with you." "All right," said Gilbert angrily. "I'll never ask you again."